This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is Akira Kurosawa, the Japanese filmmaker. I'll be speaking with Lola Martinez and David Dessa, two experts on his life and career, and the conversation will begin in a moment. As mentioned, the topic is Akira Kurosawa, the famed Japanese filmmaker. On the left of the screen, you'll see Lola Martinez. On the right, David Dessa. As I usually like to do, I like to give the guests a chance to introduce themselves, talk a little bit about what drew them to the subject and who they are and that sort of thing. So, Lola, if you could just take a couple of minutes, talk about your interest in film in general, and specifically what has drawn you to the works of Akira Kurosawa.
Right. Well, I mean, I think like most people who are interested in film, it's a lifelong interest fostered by parents and grandparents who loved film as well. Kurosawa came about partly because some of his samurai film used to be edited and on television in Chicago in the 60s. I remember seeing The Seven Samurai with my brothers. But it was when I was a student at the University of Chicago that I was part of the university film group, and we showed films almost every day of the week. But on Saturdays and Fridays and Saturdays, we showed mainstream film to make money. But the other times we ran series around specific directors. And so it was that I began to see more of Kurosawa's films. And in fact, this culminated in a year I was back at Chicago between being at Oxford University, where I was doing anthropology. And we had a film festival where through Gerald Mass, we'd managed to get hold of every print of every Kurosawa film. And we showed this, and Donald Ritchie and Audie Bock came to talk about Kurosawa. And for me, seeing all the films up to that point in his life, and you have to remember in 81, there was a hiatus going on in his career, was astonishing. It was just absolutely, it spoke to me in a way, the fact that he moved back and forth from different genres, the way he used the camera, which at that point in time I didn't quite understand that he was working with various cameras and editing intensely. And I also began to be interested, of course, in the ways, this was post-Star Wars, in which he had influenced other filmmakers. And this was something I carried with me throughout my time as an anthropologist in Japan. I began as a maritime anthropologist working with fishing people, but they spent a lot of time watching television and films and westerns. They loved American westerns, fishermen. So I became interested in general in Japanese popular culture. But when I was offered the chance to teach a course on anthropology and media, I immediately thought I wanted to teach a course on Kurosawa and how he had influenced so many filmmakers, how media, how film in general, but Kurosawa specifically was transnational and had long been transnational. So I taught that course, and the book Remaking Kurosawa was kind of the outcome of that course. And I've moved on to other things now. People still ask me to do things relating to Kurosawa, and I can't leave him behind, really, because I can go see something like Mad Max, Fury Road, and recognize the tiny little moment that seems to be a bit of a homage to Kurosawa in it. So I think he's everywhere, and I do love talking about him.
And just so you had mentioned Donald Ritchie, for anyone who doesn't know, he was sort of, I guess, America's leading, I guess, Niponophile might be the term. He had spent some decades living in Japan, and I guess when he was alive, he was probably considered the foremost expert on Japanese film, right?
He was not only the expert on film, but I think, as David will tell you, he also knew all the stories. He knew everyone very well. Yeah. And there were some stories he wouldn't tell. He would never reveal what he knew about Kurosawa's breakup with Mifune, as it were, his main actor. I did try hard in 2004. Okay. But he was generous. He was a generous scholar, and he was very welcoming to everyone who went to see him in Japan, and I was one of those lucky people.
Now, David Dessa is a person that I actually interviewed for my written interview series a few years ago, so he's one of the few people that has done both, or will be doing both the written and the video interviews. David also has written much about Akira Kurosawa. So David, if you could, as Lola did, tell a little bit about your background and your interest in, I guess, things Japanese as well as Kurosawa specifically.
Well, oddly enough, it is very likely that Lola and I were watching the same programming that showed Seven Samurai and Yojimbo in the late 1960s. It was on PBS.
All right.
I was a high school student, and I immediately fell in love with both Seven Samurai, which I'd seen, and then Yojimbo. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. As a film fan, nothing special, certainly not a Japanologist, but these Kurosawa movies really got me excited. And fortunately, at that very same time, around 69, 70, there was a movie theater in Manhattan called the Bijou, which at that time was trying to make a living showing samurai movies. And so I got a chance to see other Kurosawa movies and also some of the classic samurai movies. Excuse me. And this really turned me on to Japanese cinema. Excuse me. Also at this time, the 60s, late 60s, Rashomon was a cult movie and showed at late night, midnight kind of screenings, interestingly enough. And so between Rashomon and Seven Samurai and Yojimbo and Sanjuro, I was able to see a lot of movies. Now, I kept this love of Japanese cinema kind of in the back of my mind as I went to college and majored in English and media. And then graduate school at USC, the University of Southern California, in their film school. And when it came time to get a PhD, as I decided to do, and write my dissertation, I wrote it on Kurosawa as the most important filmmaker in my intellectual life, but also, in an odd ways, the only filmmaker I could write about without actually going to Japan. I never went to Japan until I was already a junior faculty member at the University of Illinois, from which I am now an emeritus professor. So I spent my entire career in the central Illinois. When I wrote my dissertation on Kurosawa, it got me the PhD. I got a job at Illinois. Maybe 2 years after that, I got a letter from the University Microfilm International Press, who was publishing dissertations at that time. And they asked if they could publish my dissertation, which I immediately said, "Have you read it?" And they said yes. I wasn't that proud of it at the time. I'm still not that proud of it, but it did get me my doctorate, which enabled me to do, I hope, more intensive work. But in any case, my dissertation was published as the Samurai Films of Akira Kurosawa, and I've always loved Kurosawa. I think he's the most influential filmmaker, certainly of the post-war era, and I would put him as influential as any filmmaker ever. Probably, maybe only Sergei Eisenstein is more influential. But in any case, he's a greatly influential filmmaker. His films retain their interest. When I moved away from samurai films as a kind of study, Kurosawa was still influential in terms of his modern-day stories. My favorite Kurosawa is actually High and Low. So when you think about his talent, you can see epics about samurai and epics about detectives.
Yeah.
And so that's what I think about Kurosawa. And I'm actually doing a book on what I call a masculinist tradition in American cinema. Interestingly enough, Kurosawa is central to a masculinist tradition of American cinema, despite his not quite being American.
Let me try to put Kurosawa in a little perspective for the rest of this segment, and then in the next segment, I want to talk a little bit about the man, his early youth, leading up to his filmic career. Let me ask two questions. The first is about Japanese film industry in particular. I'm not a scholar, but I've written criticism of films, and I watched it. I was telling Lola before you came on, David, how I'm pretty familiar with his 1950 to 65 period, 2 or 3 films before 50, 2 or 3 films after. 65 and Redbeard. And the thing that is the most amazing about me is I think the period from the post-war 45 till 1970, Japanese cinema is not only the greatest era of cinema that one nation produced, but I don't think there's any real question about it. You could maybe argue Italy to a degree, but before Kurosawa, just the two that come to mind are Ozu and um, Mizoguchi. The 1960s, you had Teshigahara and Oshima and a half a dozen other Kobayashi. What do you think accounted for this just sort of almost atomic bomb explosion of great films and great directors in Japan in the post-war period?
David, why don't you?
Sure. First of all, I have to say that you had no less a so-called golden age or atomic bomb explosion of great directors, also in the pre-war period of the 1930s,
Yeah.
where a lot of the, don't forget Ozu and Mizoguchi got their, to some people, made their greatest films in this era, but certainly they worked in this era. Kurosawa was an assistant director before the war, and he was working for or with some of these great directors of the 1930s. And I think it has to do with the attitude of the Japanese that despite the fact that they had a powerful studio system, they were an industry that gave their blessings to the work of directors. They encouraged directors, they trained directors, and when directors got to be directors, they pretty much left them alone, unless it was like during the occupation period where they had political things to be censored. But otherwise, it was always what. In fact, in 1959, when Donald Ritchie and Joseph Anderson wrote their book, The Japanese Film, they dedicated it to directors. And they said what any industry should be is a director's industry, and this is quite an auteurist view in 1959. But I really believe that it was a director's system as much as a genre system, as much as a star system, and that's what really accounts for one thing. The other thing I'll say is that in the 30s and the 50s, they had a domestic industry that was supported by the domestic audience. And once you can make films very specifically for a domestic industry, then you can make great movies. And that's what Hollywood in the 30s was like as well. If you could support your own industry by your domestic audience, you had a real shot at growing homegrown talent.
Yes, and I think those are important points. But I also think there's a point for some directors like Kurosawa who'd been politically active in their youth and found the sort of censorship that occurred before the war by the Japanese government itself. And then slightly more open censorship by the Americans. They were censoring different things as somehow liberating. So that not only had they been set up in this great system where the studios supported them, not only did they have audiences, and also they tended to work with the same crews throughout their time. So they had their kind of own little crew that they were happy working with. Kurosawa always liked the similar script writers and the composer. But all of that just meant that they could finally make the films they wanted to make if they'd felt somehow inhibited beforehand. And I think that kind of blossoming occurred as well. Television made inroads into that, but perhaps that's another story to tell for another time. But it was a wonderful moment in Japanese cinema, yes.
Let me just pull out a little bit further my final question for this segment. When people look back, most people would say that the dominant art form, certainly in the West in the 18th century, was poetry. The novel was the dominant art form of the 19th century. I think most cultural observers would say film was the dominant art form of the 20th century. Who knows what will happen in this 21st century, only a little over 15% in. If you agree with that, would you say that there's probably a good chance that people like the Kurosawas, the Bergmans, the Fellinis, Antonionis, Wells, Kubricks, that these great directors, centuries from now, their touchstone works, in Kurosawa's cases, the Seven Samurais, Akira, Yojimbo and Ran, these kinds of things will be thought of in the same vein that people look at some of the great works of fiction in those other forms?
Oh, that's a tough one, isn't it? I think to pick up on something David said earlier about having a domestic audience, a lot of that sort of memory, novels and poetry, depends on whether you're taught at a basic level in schools. And I think cross-culturally, Kurosawa will appear in film courses for a long time. So that there's that memory. In Japan, it's a different story. In some ways, he's not forgotten by filmmakers, but audiences are not necessarily familiar with them. I remember doing a head count at a talk I gave in 2004, and all the audience was under the age of 40, and 2 people had seen a Kurosawa film.
Wow.
So there is that problem within Japan itself. I don't know what David thinks about that, though.
I think that Lola's point about being taught is the most important thing, and it's a different thing with film. A film that's lasted 60 years, like Seven Samurai, is a film that is long-lived. But that's nothing compared to, say, obviously, the poetry of Homer. And so whether or not we remember these directors, all of whom are, of course, incredibly important and great and wonderful, really depends on how much we retain the medium. And so it's hard to know what will happen. But as long as film, in whatever form, whether it's made on video, however it's shown, as long as there's something like narrative film being made, then Kurosawa will last. But whether this will last as long as, Gregorian chants is very impossible. It's impossible to say. And we could talk about postmodernism and the compression of time and the sense of values, but in any case, as long as there's film, there will be Kurosawa. As long as there's movies, let's say, however they're made, there'll be Kurosawa.
Well, let's end on that note. In the next segment, let's dig into Kurosawa's personal life before films and leading into his film career. We'll do that in a moment. In this segment, we're going to talk about Kurosawa's background leading up to his film career. I know Kurosawa was born in 1910. What sort of family was he born into? Was he born into what would be called the bourgeoisie? Was he from dirt poor? Was he from, the upper elites? And what was his parenting like? What were his parents like?
I've just been looking at his autobiography, but do you want to start, David, and I'll fill in with.
Sure. Well, I thought from the anthropological perspective you might have things to say, but he was from a former samurai family. They were reasonably well-to-do. You could say middle class in a certain way, but you have to distinguish between a Western bourgeoisie and a Japanese bourgeoisie. So I would say that he came from a fairly strict household, but it was a stable household. It was an economically successful household. He had older brothers. He was always artistically inclined. He was always a movie fan. Things like that. His childhood didn't seem to be anything particularly out of the ordinary until 1923, when the Great Kanto earthquake destroyed much of Tokyo, and this gave Kurosawa a real sense of let's say he was only, obviously around 13, so he became quite distressed about everything. But he survived that. But other things came to be more sad. The suicide of his older brother, who was interestingly enough a Benchi, which gave him a lot of free tickets into the movies, an appreciation for the performance aspect of cinema, and of course the variety of cinema. But it also, of course, was one of the touchstones of his life, and a very sad one. There's a kind of strange tradition of suicide in Japan, and especially among the samurai class, where even Kurosawa himself would perhaps half-heartedly, but definitely attempt suicide in 1970. So I think some of these traumas were very important to him. But, I would say that overall his life was probably a pretty good one up until 1923 with the earthquake. That was such a shock to everyone, literally.
I think that's important to think a little bit about that era, 1910, the late Meiji, early Taisho and early Showa era, which is his father was probably lower echelon samurai, but there was money in the family. His mother came from a merchant household, and it was the merchants who had the money in Japan. And so he had a nursemaid. He remembers having a nursemaid, and they had a house in the countryside. He remembers going to the house in the countryside. And yes, so I think it was a very open, happy childhood. He was enough of the class of his father taught physical education, I think, of the class of people interested in education. And because I think there were eight children in his family, because he was among the younger ones, he was given a bit more of a free hand, I think, to decide he wanted to be an artist and pursue his love of Western painting. And all these things speak to an era in which Tokyo especially was very vibrant, very cosmopolitan. People were learning about Western and European, in particular, arts and literature. So he was exposed through school not only to the Japanese classics, but to European classics. And I think this is important to keep in mind. But yes, the trauma of the 1923 earthquake, and the big trauma was that it was his brother who took him to look at the disaster of the earthquake and said, you must always confront the things that you fear. And he remembers this vividly in his autobiography. And then, like many of those young people, he was drawn to socialist ideas, and he did join the proletarian youth movement. His brother was very active as the leader of the Benshi Union, and I remember seeing an interview with Honda once about Kurosawa, who when he was asked, well, was Kurosawa a communist? Honda laughed and said, we were all communists when we were young. And it was that in that vibrant era, before things began to be clamped down, he also remembers when the clampdown happened, Kurosawa was very much interested in what was going on with the poor people, the underprivileged in Tokyo. He writes about this. He writes about having to hide from his parents, that he got picked up and was arrested a few times for passing out sort of, socialist propaganda. And he went to live with his brother rather than reveal to his parents that he'd spent some time in jail. So he was very close to his brother, who was also politically active. And all these things, I think, this memory of the traditional Japan, the education that was broad, the vibrant political ideas of his youth, I think all of those tell us something about the man he came to be.
By clampdown, are you referring to the rise of the nationalists? And if so, in the 1930s with the invasion of Manchuria, did Kurosawa ever get drafted, or did he avoid military service?
He was called up when he was 20. I was just reading his autobiography, which is why I have it rereading his autobiography. And he couldn't pass the physical. In fact, he'd been terrible at physical education in school, he pointed out. And he wasn't called up again till 45, when and then Yokohama was bombed, and he never did military service. So
Okay.
no, he never did military service.
It's ironic that the greatest director of samurai movies couldn't pass the physical. He was also probably too tall. Kurosawa was very tall.
Yes.
And I think that actually had to do with his poor physical condition in an era when most Japanese men were very short. I think his health was. But in any case, the other thing about Kurosawa was, I think, Lowell was quite right to bring up the Taisho era, which was a very heady, so to speak, time for Japan, when all kinds of ideas were in the air. Socialism, communism, anarchism, a lot of Western importation of novels and plays. And Kurosawa always had an interest in Western works. And the big thing, because so many were, as Honda joked, communists, one of their greatest influences was Russian culture.
Yes.
Russian novels, Russian plays, the theories of Stanislavski, etc. So Kurosawa, who would of course make adaptations from Russian sources, was exposed to so many of these things when he was young and impressionable and ready to make his mark in the world as an artist. And so his post-war films that have so many so-called Western content or Western ideas also stems from his being brought up in an era of openness, and indeed, clampdown was the gradual process of the Japanese militarists, who would eventually, of course, put their mark on all of cinema. And ironically, Kurosawa, this great thinker, got his start during the repressive era of Japanese militarism in the middle of the 1940s.
So now I know that several famed directors started out as critics beforehand. Did Kurosawa ever write for any film magazines, if there were any, in that era? Or how did he just get started into the studio system?
No, he didn't. The studio system for 30 years, maybe a little longer, would recruit assistant directors by exam. And so you took a test, basically. When Kurosawa got into the business, he was lucky in that Toho Studios was formed by a conglomeration of other studios, and they had literally no directors for Toho. So when he took the test, of course, he was a great artist, and he knew a lot about movies, but he didn't make his mark as a critic. He made his mark by taking the test to be an assistant director, and he got in and worked with the new Toho Studios.
But I think it's important to point out that you also had a system where there was a lot of publication about films. So even if he wasn't writing, he could be reading journals about films. And quite often, if a film wasn't shown in Japan, it could still be very carefully described, frame by frame, in one of these journals. And I think that was part of his education as well.
So I know he worked as an AD on, almost 20 films. Was he considered like a prodigy? Was there anything like called the next big thing? Was he a promising director that Toho was just looking for the first good project to come along to let him go on his own?
Probably not. By the time he was ready to go on his own, Japan was at war. They were cutting back on films. Second of all, they had so many great filmmakers working that Kurosawa was probably just going to be another good director. But I never read that he was talked about, like a big NFL draft prospect.
Yeah.
In fact, I get the impression that he was seen as too headstrong for his own good. He liked having his own way, and he would clash sometimes as AD. He's got a famous moment on Horses, where they tried to edit something out, and he didn't want it edited out, and that's considered he wasn't respectful enough, I guess, of his senior directors. But he got there.
He got there.
Well, let's end this segment talking about sort of the early part of Kurosawa, because Rashomon generally sort of marks the beginning of what most people call his heyday. That's one of the films that made his name. I've only seen Quiet Duel, Stray Dog, and Drunken Angel from the pre-Rashomon era. Let's talk about, because it looks like there's about 8, 9, 10 films that he directed in a very short order in the mid to late 40s. His first one was in Shiro Sagata. Was that a film that sort of marked him as promising, or was that something that just came and went?
Oh no, it didn't come. It didn't. No, it marked him as promising and successful. The problem was that all of the films made in Japan at this period were essentially propaganda movies. Now, Kurosawa, like Ozu, kept the propaganda relatively mild, but nevertheless, it was a film about judo. Also, its English name is sometimes Judo Saga, and it's a film about judo, and judo is Japan's national sport, and so it's a kind of allegory of nationalism. But its action and its characters were handled very well, and it was a very successful film in terms of what could be successful in those days, when the Japanese were only making about 40 films a year. But it was very successful, very promising, and the only problem with the movie is that for many years it was censored by the occupation, who thought it was nationalistic. So it couldn't be seen in the era when Kurosawa was breaking through with Rashomon. You couldn't see what is actually not only his first movie, but his first very good movie.
And he went on to have problems with those who tread on the tiger's tail, which was censored both by the Japanese side and then by the Americans afterwards. One for being irreverent about samurai, and the other one for being too respectful. So he did try and sneak his own vision in. One of the ways he made a living during this era, which both Galbraith mentions, is he wrote a lot of screenplays. So although he tried not to be nationalistic or propagandistic in his films, I think there are screenplays he wrote that perhaps might be seen as more pro the war, but he had to make a living, as he points out. He makes a joke about when he married finally in 45, his wife, who was an actress, discovered his salary was less than a third of hers as a rising movie star. So they were very poor in the beginning of life. He wasn't well paid, and screenwriting was one of the ways he made his money.
Since Sagata apparently had a sequel, was that one of those things that the first film did so well, so they just did that again, or was that was it a planned sequel?
I don't know if it was not a planned sequel, but people don't talk much about the sequel, so I suppose that it just seems to be one of those things that you make because the first one was okay.
As I said, I've just been quickly looking at his autobiography, and he claims he didn't want to make it, but the studio made him make it.
How about some of the other early films? Is there anyone that stands out? As I said, The Quiet Duel, Stray Dog, and Drunken Angel, to me, are all good films, but there's still something missing from the classic films. He hadn't exactly become really Kurosawa as he's, thought of now in terms of the complexity and the psychological depth. What film or two from that pre-Rashomon period would either of you say is the standout work from that era?
Oh dear. So hard to pick one. I do like No Regrets for Our Youth, which was politically said something that Kurosawa, I think, wanted to say but hadn't been able to say. And it came from who he was, but also his engagement with other politically active actors and actresses. And it's the story of the daughter of a university professor who falls in love with somebody who's a radical, who ends up being jailed and then killed by the government during the war. Setsuko Hara's in it, and she is wonderful in that film. And it's so hard to choose. I mean, I could go on about all the other ones, but I'll stay with that one. And I saw David nodding, so maybe I've taken his choice.
Well, yes and no. I was hoping you would take that one, given your interest in Kurosawa's Woman, and it is generally thought of as a wonderful movie, and as well it should be. And it is the only time he worked with Japan's most important actress of the post-war era. Interestingly enough. And one of the few times, if not the only time, he made a woman as his outright heroine.
Yeah.
Most interesting women generally after that are villainesses. So it's a great movie. So, Dan, not to be disrespectful, but I actually think that is a wonderful movie, and as is Stray Dog.
Yes.
The more that people talk about Stray Dog and think about Stray Dog, the more they realize how excellent it is. If you don't think it's a great movie, at least one sees things in it that are very Kurosawa-like. For instance, the relationship between an older, skilled man and a younger, eager learner, played by the same two who would then be in Seven Samurai, as the skilled man and the younger, sort of eager learner. That is to say, Takashi Shimura and Toshiro Mifune. The camera work is superb. The setting is unbelievable. Its most famous sequence is a virtual wordless montage of Mifune walking around the ruined city of Tokyo. In a certain way, it functions as a kind of neo-documentary. So everything about, and it's like a film noir as well. So everything about Stray Dog is certainly very successful. And I would say that despite Rashomon's fame, and deservedly so, that if you had to watch one movie 10 times, I think you'd rather watch Stray Dog than Rashomon, just in terms of its entertainment value and its dynamism and excitement. And it's just that, Rashomon was so different than anything Americans had seen that they glommed onto it, whereas No Regrets for Our Youth and Stray Dog look like very, very, very good regular movies, but they're both really very good. So
And I think they share that. They're a commentary on what has been, because the thing I've just written about Stray Dog for publication on Asian film noir, and the thing about it is it's after the war. Mifune is an ex-soldier who's become a police officer. He's chasing another ex-soldier who's become a criminal. And everything you couldn't say under the Americans about what it was to lose a war or have post-traumatic stress syndrome is in that film. It's there if you look for it. And it's about that struggle to be a man, an appropriate man in a new era, and not to be a violent man or too violent. He defeats the bad guy without having to shoot him, right? So I agree with that. But I like the fact that he had the courage also to talk about the people who suffered during the war for their political beliefs, and that's one of the reasons I went down with No Regrets for Our Youth. It had to be a way he and many had to think about their youth, I think, not to regret it.
You'd mentioned those films from the 40s here, and Takashi Shimura is, I think, a great actor. You know, just as Setsuko Hara and Shishu Ryu are associated with Ozu, Mifune clearly is associated with Kurosawa, and Shimura is always sort of like, you know, the second guy associated with him. But you know, as great and as bold and star-filled as Mifune is, I actually think Shimura overall had a greater acting range, and he played a greater range of roles. I could imagine him. I mean, we can see he could play the action later on. We'll talk about Seven Samurai, but I can't really imagine Mifune pulling off something like the bureaucrat in Akira, whereas Shimura seemed to almost be chameleon-like in that he could change himself from film to film, that you could barely recognize him. Whereas Mifune, even when he would change appearance here or there was always, he had that John Wayne kind of thing, that he's much better actor than John Wayne, I think, by far, but he was always the huge glowing light, neon light star, whereas Mifune was the guy who could, you might not even recognize him in a role sometimes. Talk about Mifune and Kurosawa, either of you, just to end this segment. Oh, not Mifune, Shimura, I'm sorry.
I agree with you, Dan. I think Shimura was a brilliant character actor. He knew how to be quiet in a way that perhaps Mifune didn't quite know how to do. But we could argue about that as he got older. But sort of emotion was Mifune's thing, and repressed emotion was Shimura's more Japanese approach to things. He didn't just work for Kurosawa. I mean, he had a varied career throughout, working with.
I first saw him in Godzilla as a kid.
Well, yes, but before that even.
Yes.
He just was a brilliant actor, and not one for the pizzazz, perhaps, but very good at what he did. I don't know what you would add to that, David. You may know a bit.
Just that by 1957, Shimura was kind of finished because he was getting. Remember, his role in Yojimbo is very, very small. So, but Shimura was a very important character actor of the 1930s.
Yes.
And so by the time Kurosawa begins to use him regularly, he's just not so young anymore. So, but there's no question. I mean, I've seen Shimura in musicals, and he could sing. So there's no question about his ability to work in lots of genres. But there's no question that Kurosawa knew how great an actor he was, because the only film that Mifune is not in after the Rashomon era, or even before that, say from Drunken Angel, is Ikiru. And so there's no room. I think I've written somewhere that I just said there was no room for Mifune in a film like Ikiru, which was all about sort of the way that the Japanese bureaucratic system pounded down people, and you just couldn't pound down Mifune so well.
Yeah.
I think that's what attracted him to Mifune. But you're right, and in that sense, Kurosawa did a wonderful thing to give this character actor the leading role. And it's a film. I said a lot of young people don't know who Kurosawa is, but Japanese middle-aged people often do, and one of their favorite films is Ikiru. It really still speaks to them. And I think it's that performance that does it
Well,
as much as the story.
let's end this segment. In the next segment, I want to talk basically about what the films from Rashomon through Redbeard, which are most closely associated in most people's mind as sort of prime Kurosawa, and we'll do that when we return. As with many directors, there's usually a time period that's considered their golden age. Here in America, I've always said Woody Allen's golden age is probably from Annie Hall to Husbands and Wives. Ingmar Bergman, it's the 1960s and all of his experimental films. Neorealism had several Italian directors who were working in their prime. And for me, basically, Rashomon through Redbeard is, you have the films that virtually everyone who thinks of Kurosawa refers to an image or a moment or an actor or a scene from one of those films that go, Kurosawa. So let's talk about this incredible run of a decade and a half and almost as many films. In that run, the only films that I've not seen are The Idiot, Record of a Living Being, and The Lower Depths. All the rest I have been able to see. And we talked about Rashomon, and Rashomon is not only the film that sort of, I guess, made Kurosawa's name to a degree in, I guess, art circles, filmic art circles, but it's so influential because of the four different viewpoints that something called the Rashomon effect has been coined in terms of that, how different people see things different ways. I think it's arguably a great film. For me, though, and I'm just interested in your opinion, it has probably the worst ending of any film you could argue as great, with the exception of The Trial by Orson Welles. The last 7 minutes, it seems you have this film that's so daring, and then we have the baby, the tears, the sun comes out, walking, redemption, and it's almost like you're in a sugary soap opera after all of this just innovative stuff. And I know, David, you just said that you had preferred an earlier film. Let's talk about Rashomon, just its effect, how it set Kurosawa up, and do you agree about the ending being weak? Either one of you, Lola, if you want to go first. I don't know.
Well, I think it's Rashomon's interesting for many reasons, and one is that everyone remembers it's a story from 4 points of view, but it's a story from 4 points of view being retold through two men. So so it's even more complicated than you might think of, because it's the priest and the woodcutter who are retelling everything they've heard of the trial. And Kurosawa himself said he thought it was an interesting film because it was about a rape. And many people, in discussing the film, think about it as a murder mystery, and not the fact that at its heart is the rape of a woman. So I thought I'd just get that in because I'm thinking of Kurosawa's women. I know Donald Ritchie hated the ending. He said as much in his book on the film, and also in conversation with me about why he loved Ozu more than he loved Kurosawa. He always thought Kurosawa played the sentimental hand, and that undermined many of his films. I'm not so sure. I think it's if the film is, as many people think it is, partially a commentary on Japan after the war and under the U.S. occupation, then the idea that there had to be a certain generosity and a new generation coming along is an important part of that film. So that's one thing I'll say about it. I'm not so prone to thinking it's overly sentimental. The other couple of things to say about Rashomon is, if you talk to people who Japanese specialists who work on Japanese film, they will say all those wonderful techniques that Kurosawa used in that film, that everyone goes, that other Japanese filmmakers were using. So from the Japanese point of view, it's a puzzling film, and also it didn't seem to be doing such radically new things given what other film directors around Kurosawa were doing in Japan. So I think it had a different reception in Japan than it had in film circles outside Japan. No, I think I'll leave it at that. I won't go on anymore about it because I see David is raring to go.
I like what you said very much, especially I think of it as a commentary on existential zeitgeist of the post-war era, certainly, but remembering that it's based on two stories by Japan's first great modernist writer, Akira Kurosawa. I think that the thing about the ending is that this was, of course, as is well known, Kurosawa's addition. In the two stories that he adopts from Akira, there is no woodcutter who takes a baby and goes off with it and all that. So that's Kurosawa's addition to the story. It is probably a sign of hope, some sort of redemption. For me, one of Kurosawa's major sort of through lines of his films up to, say, Dodesca Den, is the question of heroism. And what does it mean to be a hero within the circumstances in which you find yourself? So in a certain way, the woodcutter who has proven himself quite cowardly, first in lying about what he thinks he saw, in failing to mention his thievery of the jeweled dagger and something else, I forget. He redeems himself by making what would be a huge sacrifice, and that is to take in a child. So in that respect, Kurosawa is trying for some kind of look. If he doesn't have that ending, then first of all, then he has a very short movie. He only has a seven. Rashomon's very, very short, but also he has a very bleak movie, or at least a movie that's very, very puzzling without even coming close to some kind of denouement. So I think the ending is fine. Rashomon is not one of my favorite Kurosawa movies, so the ending doesn't necessarily hurt what is, after all, a nice movie, but not one of my favorites.
The thing, if I could just interject and ask a question, the character that I find the most interesting, even though he appears in maybe only a total of 7 or 8 minutes, is sort of the bullying hobo kind of character who bullies the woodcutter into telling the story, and he sort of bullies the priest who's there at the ruins too, because he seems to be a stand-in for the audience, and that he's saying, all of you are bullshitters. You're skewing it. You're skewing what they skewed. And yet, even though he's probably the most, with the exception of the Mifune thief character, he's clearly in the diegetic world outside that film, probably the most scurvy dog of them all. But he's the only one that seems to recognize that about human nature. He seems to be the only character that really seems to understand human nature in that film.
Well, he understands a certain type of human nature because he's offset against the Buddhist priest who believes in compassion and has another view on human nature. And I think if you include the priest, you then include the possibility of hope. I mean, one of the ways I found myself thinking about Rashomon when I wrote about it and the various ways it's been remade in Hollywood and other places is that there is a moment, and you get it in Europe as well, and you get it in the post-communist world in the 1990s, when if you're a society that has been defeated or been undermined by loss of war or loss of ideology, suddenly everything changes overnight. One story becomes another story. No, we were not wonderful, glorious Japanese bringing enlightenment to the Pacific Rim. We were actually villains and doing terrible things. Suddenly your history is very different. And so for me, Rashomon does share something with Stray Dog about how do you keep on living when everything you were told was true is now you're being told was false and wrong. And everything that was heroic is now no longer heroic. And so you're thinking about masculinity, David. I think Kurosawa was thinking a lot about Japanese men's lost masculinity in the post-war era. And Rashomon's an interesting example of different ways to be a man. You could be scurvy, you could be a bandit, you could be a priest, you could be a father who has weaknesses but then tries to do his best. And that's perhaps another way we could look at that film.
The Idiot. Let's talk about that, because I've not seen that, as I've mentioned. I've read the Dostoevsky Source novel, and I think it's often overlooked in comparison to Crime and Punishment and the brothers Karamazov. What did Kurosawa do? Did he update that to modern Japan, or is that set in historical Japan? How did he approach translating that?
No, it's updated to modern Japan, but it's set in is it set in Hokkaido?
It's set in Hokkaido.
Yeah, so it's a very snowy landscape, and I think he uses that to keep the number of characters down. The problem with The Idiot, well, was twofold. One, it was released in a shortened version. It was the first time Kurosawa really tried to make a film of epic length, and the studio would have none of it. But when you see it in its full version, which it's available, all of the thing about Kurosawa that's nice is that I believe every single one of his movies is available.
No,
I don't think there's any, because we were talking before about the pre-1950s movies, and we should not forget One Wonderful Sunday, which is a very charming film, again, unique in Kurosawa's output, about a couple, just a very ordinary couple on a very ordinary day at a very specific time. But in any case, The Idiot, I would say, is Kurosawa's only outright failure of a film, and it just doesn't seem to work for me, and probably for most people, and I'm not sure exactly why, but it just doesn't. Perhaps go ahead.
I was going to say there was some outcry with Setsuko Hara as the mistress, semi-prostitute, crazy character. The audiences couldn't take her in that role.
Yeah, I said before that was the only time he worked with Japan's leading actors, but I've forgotten about the Idiot. I think everybody in it is good, but it just doesn't seem to work. A lot of the sort of interiority of Dostoevsky, which would be, I suppose, impossible to translate onto film in any case, it just doesn't come through. So it's a nice looking film, but it's too long for relatively little payoff, I guess.
Now, I think it was David, I think you had said that you prefer Ozu to Kurosawa, and Ozu is my favorite of the Japanese director. He's a great director. I think Kurosawa is more diverse, but the most Ozu-like film that I've seen from Kurosawa is the next one, Akira. I mean, it's one of those things that focuses on the little moments. You have the Shimura character who plays a petty bureaucrat who is diagnosed with stomach cancer, and he has this transformation, and he sees things that he didn't notice before. He tries to reconcile with his son. He has flashbacks to his earlier days. And then the most jarring thing, like with Rashomon, is we get that great, about 2/3 into the film, the main character disappears, aside from a few flashbacks, and we get everyone talking about the character. So it's almost the reverse of the star entry of, say, someone like Harry Lime in The Third Man, where everyone is talking about him for most of the film, and then he comes in. Here, we've seen the guy, and now the end of the film, everyone's talking about this radical change in him. Lola, maybe if you want to talk a little bit about Akira for people who don't know it.
Well, David has written the most brilliant article on it.
Go ahead, David, then.
Which I've written about it recently. It hasn't been published yet, but I had to go back to what David had to say about it. So can I point you to David? And then
go ahead, David.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for those kind words. I think that Akira is his first genuine masterpiece. It was very well respected in Japan, as Lola mentioned. The middle-aged and older Japanese certainly know it. When it first was shown in the West, it was a bit of a surprise because it isn't a period film. But it is a film about a bureaucrat who, when he learns that he's dying, decides to try and do something with his life when he realizes he hasn't done anything. But what he tries to do is actually very simple. And again, it's about heroism within the context of your own life. The bureaucracy at the time, and as all bureaucracies are, are meant to pound you down, keep you from bucking the system, keep you within the system. And this guy tries to do something what should be fairly simple, which is to clean up a fetid swamp. Again, we're still in post-war Tokyo in 1952, and turn it into a playground for the neighborhood. And we realize how almost impossible it is, not only confronting the other bureaucrats, but in one sense confronting gangsters, and through force of will, but in a very modest way. Unlike Mifune, whom we imagine would kind of beat up everybody in his path, by his modesty and his self-effacement, he gets the job done. And when he dies, 2/3 of the way through, we have this wonderful scene of his wake. And I call this the Rashomon effect.
Exactly.
In which everybody who talks about him replays through their own perspective how it was that this park got built. And everyone insisting that, yes, Watanabe, his name, Watanabe was a great guy and he did a great job, but
they were the ones.
Yeah, so that's why it is. And you talked before about Richie didn't like Kurosawa so much for his sentimentality. Sentimentality is a relative term.
Yeah.
Sentiment
right.
can be earned.
Yeah.
And in this film, Kurosawa earns every wet eye in the house. Certainly he tries to do it, but I think it's an earned sentimentality.
Right.
Ozu is definitely anti-sentiment, but except in a very quiet way.
You could call this a sentimental film, but not a sentimentalist film, in that it's not going for the tearjerker.
Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely.
And there are some harsh moments in the film. He's remembering bringing up his son early on in the film. And the last thing he remembers about this son, who comes off fairly badly through most of the film as sort of grasping and cold with a wife who's just like him, is he's going off to war.
Yeah.
So there's this kind of little commentary about a generation of men come back from war who seem to be entirely different than they had been before. And there's that wonderful Rashomon moment, but he undermines it in a way he never does in Rashomon. In Rashomon, he shows the story as each person tells it. In Ikiru, he shows the story as it actually happened. So it tells us the filmed vignettes tell the lie that each individual is presenting when they're saying, well, it was really me who stamped it and made sure it happened. And so he kind of played with the Rashomon thing and twisted it around a little to say, well, the truth will out.
And the great thing is in that last segment where everyone's talking about him, there's one of the bureaucrats who sort of idolizes Watanabe, and he's not putting up the usual puffery that these other guys are. And there's the great scene where he sort of sinks behind the paperwork. He goes out to the park. And you have the idea that this guy wants to be the next Watanabe, but because he doesn't have the stomach cancer, he doesn't have that thing that compels him to make his mark, he's probably going to end up just like the rest of those guys and not doing anything. And so you get sort of a kind of, I think, a real honest commentary on that, and how, if Watanabe hadn't gotten the stomach cancer, there would have been no film in a sense.
Yes, but the stomach cancer is merely, the objective correlative for the notion that we
or the
all
MacGuffin.
have a kind of cancer that will end our life. And the question is, what are we going to do with our life before that happens? So the stomach cancer is just the narrative. It's like almost a MacGuffin.
Yeah.
This gives him the impetus. He finally realizes what we all should realize. But you're right about the younger guy who wants to be a Watanabe-like character, but he won't. I agree with you. And that's, again, I don't want to keep bringing the same point up, but the difficulty of heroism is precisely that. If you want it, we can't all be Watanabes. If we were, then we would live in a very different and, of course, much better world.
Yeah. Now, the next... Go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Lola.
I think I have to put in a word for the female character, because I've mentioned the grasping wife, but there's also the young woman who quits his office, with whom he hangs out for a few days trying to get some warmth, because she's a very warm, open person. Not in a romantic way, I don't think. She worries it might be that at one point. And she's the one who tells him, go out and make something, do something. And I think he's also saying something about women again, which is we need their encouragement. And don't forget, the film begins with the women of the neighborhood complaining about that song, and being sent round for months by Watanabe in the first place to different departments trying to get the job done, until they end up shouting at his desk again. So in a quiet way, he's also saying we have to pay attention to the people around us who may actually have a better grasp on what needs to be done in life, and that those might be the women.
Now we could probably do a whole show on the next film, Seven Samurai. I mean, because it is, as you mentioned, the most influential. So I don't want to spend as much time on it since there's loads of material on it online. But it's interesting when I saw the Akira Criterion extra features. I think 5 of the 7 samurai appear in it, and unless you're actually watching it, you can't really notice them. Uh, because they're so different from their iconic roles in that film. And Seven Samurai, the sort of the seminal modern action film, but yet the characterizations of each of the 7 samurai is so deep. And not only the samurai, but the cowardly villagers. There's at least half a dozen of the cowardly villagers that we know. We even get small glimpses of the bandits that there, and some of the people that in the town where they go to recruit the samurai. Um, so I guess let me start with David. If you could just sort of, I guess, in a nutshell, is this, would you consider this to be his masterpiece, as probably 90% of critics and historians do?
My feeling about Kurosawa is he's got like 5 films that I would consider his masterpiece, but Seven Samurai is certainly one of them. Fortunately, he was able to keep the 220-minute version.
Yeah.
Remember that Seven Samurai was released initially in the West as a 160-minute version, which is not short, but it was also released under the title of Magnificent Seven, and it did very well in the art circuit, by the way, in its 160-minute version. But in its full version, I like what you said, Dan, about the way in which we get a glimpse of just about everybody. And so in its full version, it is virtually a portrait of a period in which all kinds of people have made all kinds of choices in the way they live their lives. And we're going to focus on these 7 guys who try and do the right thing. I like what you say also about cowardly villagers. I think Kurosawa would probably disagree with you,
Yeah.
and he would simply say the ordinary villagers who become heroic with a little bit of prodding. Villagers who are not, as we come to learn, because the film is so great, villagers who are not used to fighting, villagers who have their whole life been oppressed by men with swords. And so how many of us would be not cowardly or cowed, let us say, in such circumstances? But clearly it's the best film ever made about men at war, men in action, the kind of characters that such men are, and also its handling of action scenes is the most influential. Along with Eisenstein,
Yes.
the handling of action scenes is the most influential, I think, in the history of cinema.
I think that's very important. And one of the things that was interesting at looking at all the other versions of the 7 samurai, which there are even science fiction versions, and they're about to make a new one. Chris Pratt's going to be one of the Magnificent Seven, not a samurai, but the cowboy remake. There have been television versions of the Magnificent Seven. Is that the characters he creates in such depth, they've become stereotypical in the remakes. So people don't spend as much time telling us their backstory. Whereas Kurosawa fleshes out these things in very careful ways. And for me, the most careful way is in the longer version, where there's something mysterious going on with Rekichi, who's the young villager who encourages everyone to try and find samurai. Women nag them to find samurai. And it's only at the end that we realize that his wife's been given to the bandits, that the villagers, in desperation not to be invaded yet again by the bandits, have been giving women to the bandits. And that this moment's lost in the shorter version. But in the long version, I think there's a real shock to that moment when you realize this is the price they've been paying. And now is the time for them to do something about it. That I don't think we see in any of the remakes, that there's, it all becomes a kind of, this is the story. People don't know how to fight. 7 guys come and help them figure it out. there is a greatness to that film that I don't think anyone's
Well, yeah, I
matched.
mean,
But I,
The Yul Brynner remake is a comic book compared to a great novel. I mean, that's the basic difference. And as a kid, I enjoyed The Magnificent Seven, but once I saw Seven Samurai, I mean, they're not on the same planet as an art form. I mean, it's the depth is the range of characterization is just it's almost as if Magnificent Seven is a good solid parody almost of Seven Samurai. But I wanted to talk just two other things about this film before we move on. Mifune's character, in a sense, is sort of like a steroided up, deeper version of the wild man he played in Rashomon, and this, I guess, cemented him along with the Samurai trilogy, which I think came out in the same year. Those three films, as this sort of samurai, yeah, as the samurai. Okay, as the samurai sort of icon. Was this that film that made Mifune the international superstar then too?
Probably,
yeah.
probably. Although his performance in Rashomon was perhaps commented on as much or more than all the others, with maybe Kilmachiko, who
Yes.
are very significant and tremendous actors. But Mifune in Rashomon, followed by both Samurai Part One and Seven Samurai, certainly made him the international star. There's no question about it.
And I think it's also sad in a way, because if you look at him in the contemporary films that Kurosawa cast him in, beginning with Drunken Angel and Stray Dog, which we've already talked about, Mifune could do a different sort of character who wasn't just holding a sword and shouting and being typecast in that way. I think limited what he could do when he was cast outside Japan, for example, and perhaps when later in his life he was just interested in kind of making money, he took roles that spoke to him as a samurai character, and we lose that. I mean, he always was a huge emotive actor, but we lose the more subtle Mifune. So there was a downside to it, I think, for him.
Record of a Living Being is the next film. I again have not seen that one, but I've read some things where a lot of people think that's I think that's set in contemporary times, is it not?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Could you tell me a little bit about that for people who are watching?
Well, it's a tour de force performance by Mifune.
Yeah.
As an older man. He's an old man makeup. And it speaks to something, again, that the Japanese weren't talking a lot about, which the experience of the atomic bomb. So it's a man who, when he hears about the fishing boat that's accidentally exposed in a practice nuclear bomb explosion in the Pacific,
which was a real event. Which was a real event.
Which was a real event. Begins to say it's going to happen again. Japan is going to be bombed again, and I do not want to be in Japan. I'm going to sell up my successful business and move my family to Brazil. And it's about not only that very real fear that people must have felt, but also about the family politics. Of course, the family doesn't want to go to Brazil. Of course, they don't see the future as he does. And I think it is one of Mifune's great performances. I don't know if you agree, David.
I absolutely agree. And it's a very sad film. I mean, Lola's quite right. It's one of the few direct confrontations with the bomb. It's about the only country in the world who's been exposed to the bomb in a wartime setting, re-exposed in the irradiation of the fishing boat, and now the question is also continually reminded. One of the brilliant things about Record of a Living Being is the use of the sound of American jet fighters.
Yes.
And so they're continually reminded of the nuclear America by the presence of American air bases and armed forces on Japanese soil. And this guy has what could be thought of as a reasonable response. Unfortunately, most people think his response is unreasonable, that he has the Western title for the film was I Live in Fear,
yes.
Which is much more tendentious, but it also describes that the guy lives in fear. But it becomes a family drama because he has a wife and a mistress, two families, None of them want to move to Brazil. They all think he's crazy. They also want his money. They don't want him to sell it off. So the question becomes, how crazy is he? And is he being sort of forced? The film ends with him in a mental institution. It's quite grim. And in a certain way, Kurosawa is talking about the whole of society. Are we repressing the discourse of the atomic bomb and telling people that they're crazy? And we don't want to hear it. And I think that's what the film's about.
Now, the next year he did Lower Depths and Throne of Blood, and I've not seen Lower Depths. Throne of Blood, of those films in that golden period of his that I've seen, to me seems to be the weakest of the films. It's got a few interesting images. The ending is certainly bravura with all the arrows, but for me, especially later seeing Kagemusha and Ran, it seems that that film is almost sort of like a dry run for those longer, bigger, more complex films. What are your comments on both of those films from 1957?
Throne of Blood is the best, and I think film critics agree with it, the best version of Macbeth on film. It has wonderful moments. There's that moment where they're lost in the forest and they're moving, that continuous shot.
Yeah,
as they're
in the
lost
fog.
in the mist. It's astonishing. It just, I just can't say how brilliant it is. I'm surprised that you think of it as a weak film. For me, it's up there with Seven Samurai. Yes, he does the whole kabuki thing, but I think that in a way that speaks to Shakespeare. He was trying to say something about traditional theater. And he also gives a reason for things that we don't get in Shakespeare. Why does Lady Macbeth go mad? She was pregnant. She loses a child. Why does Macbeth do everything she tells him to? She was pregnant. They're going to have a child. He wants a kingdom. I just think it's a brilliant film. I disagree with you on that one, Dan.
I think it's a brilliant film. It's not as spectacularly brilliant as Ran, which is this big budget, unbelievable. But it's a film of so many good moments that you can't say it's not a great movie. I mean, what is a great movie but a movie that goes from great moment to great moment to great moment? I mean, the scene where Washizu goes off to kill the king, and we focus on his wife as she does her no-like dance and stillness with that makeup and the look on her face. Tremendous actress, of course, in the role, Yamada. In that that's just one of the great moments in the history of film. I mean, there's no way. But also, I like to talk about Kurosawa as a filmmaker interested in storytelling. The very beginning of the film, where the main samurai are sitting in a line, being very, very still, and these guys come rushing off, into the frame and giving the reports. Washizu was captured the first fort. Washizu was captured. I mean, that's just a great way to tell a story. All kinds of things in that movie. Even though interestingly enough, I wouldn't put it in my top 5 of Kurosawa. I wouldn't, but there's no question of how great a film it is in terms of just the way he tells that story and the little things that he does and the big things that he does, like the arrows. I mean, it's just a great film.
How about Lower Depths?
Talk about the Lower Depths, which a lot of people like as an adaptation of Gorky's The Lower Depths. It's a very interesting film because Mifune plays a very weak character. He's not able to take the lady that he loves and go off and do the things that he wants to do. And he's living in this very weirdly imaged kind of hovel.
Is it a historical version or modern?
No, it's not. It's a semi-historical. It takes
Okay.
place in the Meiji era.
Okay.
Just a few years after the samurai class has been abolished, and there's a lot of social unrest, but not armed conflict. So it takes place in the Meiji era to remove it. But as one wonderful scholar named Olga Solovieva has demonstrated, it's a film about the post-war era very clearly. But we forget that now because we're not so conversant with the kind of imagery of post-war Japan. But it's another allegory of the post-war era. That's pretty good. It's pretty good.
It's good. I mean, the you spoke about the movement and the dance in Throne of Blood. There's a moment like that where they all the poor people who are hungry and suffering, and they start playing a bit of music and dancing. And for me, that's a wonderful moment in the lower dance. You're right; it's not one of the great Gorky adaptations, but it does have those moments where you never forget. You never forget how it was framed and put together, and how the actors pulled it off.
Now, Hidden Fortress is now years later famed because of the supposed ties to Lucas and him adapting it in Star Wars. But when I rewatched the main films of this main period a month or two ago in preparation for this, this is a riotously funny film at times. It just like Akira shows that he could do modern deep drama when people who think of him as this historical filmmaker come to that film. I mean, he could do comedy, and we've thrown around these Shakespeare adaptations, and to me, the worst thing about Shakespeare are his comedies. Kurosawa did wonderful comedies, and the thing that I find about this film is that Mifune is playing a typical Mifune strong leader, but in every scene where the young girl or the two idiots are involved, Mifune lets them upstage him. He sort of willingly, he knows that people are coming to watch these buffoons or to see the young girl, and she's almost in this Robin Hood like character. So let me just ask you, Lola, talk a bit about the young girl character, the princess, and also the two buffoons. And would you agree that they steal those scenes from Mifune, in that film?
Oh, definitely they do. And it was interesting. There was a Japanese remake a few years ago where they just couldn't get that right. They cast two young sort of music idols in those roles, or one young music idol in those roles, and it just didn't work out. They're wonderful comedians. The film is striking for so many reasons. It's not perfect. It had three screenwriters. It was very popular. It was one of Kurosawa's moneymakers. But it has its striking moments, and one of it is that the female character, who I think if you look now to the latest Star Wars, she's kind of in the way that Lucas always turns to Kurosawa, as to he does to other people, not just to Kurosawa. There's a bit of her and Rey in the current Star Wars. So she's this kind of wonderful character that prefigures a lot of the modern anime figures you get in Miyazaki, perhaps some of those young characters. But you have moments like that opening scene where the samurai's dying, and one of my students, when I showed it to them, said it looks like a nuclear landscape, and then this samurai dies in slow motion in it. So you have to ask yourself, what is this war about, and where, again, is it a commentary, still a late commentary, still a post-war film? And for me, the scene in the film that never fails to make me just sit up in wonder is the one where Mifune chases the horseman who comes after them back into their camp. It's done in a long single shot. Mifune, who learned to ride in Manchuria as a young man, is at his ease on that horse, and it's just, every time I see it, I just go, wow, who's done this? Who has bettered this scene? Not a strong film, though, in some ways.
I think it is a comedy, and I think Mifune, in some ways, is almost doing a parody of Mifune. Almost. I mean, the makeup's a little overdone, and all of the kind of values that he embodies are a bit overdone. But I think overall, it's basically a comedy with some interesting commentary. Such as, we don't really know what the war is about, and so we have a lot of useless slaughter. but basically, I mean, to me, it's the most important film because it's the first time he uses CinemaScope.
Yeah.
And Lola's point about that scene, I mean, I'm glad she remembers that scene because that's my favorite as well. But think of it not just as this wonderful chase, this long take, but also the use of the scope frame to highlight off-screen space, so that when the guy he's chasing goes into the camp, and Mifune's chasing him and comes off-screen into the camp, it's like, wow! Also, you think, he's in some trouble now. There's hundreds of guys. But it's a film that I think is more style than substance. But, it's in a way it's sad, and in a way it's good that Lucas paid homage to it. You can't knock a film that was part of the inspiration for the most successful movie ever made. So, and it shows you how good Kurosawa is, that people can take even a minor film and turn it into what turns out to be a fairly important movie. And I like Lola's point very much about the new Star Wars and its use of the female character, because in a certain way she's the same physical type.
Yeah.
She's this kind of young, lithe, athletic woman is what do you call it? Feels very constrained by her circumstances and wants to rip herself free. So I think that's a very good point as well.
My favorite moment in that film, and one of my favorite moments is all Kurosawa, is where the two idiots are going to the hidden fortress and they're climbing up the scree on the side of the mountain, and then later they're coming down the scree and they're struggling to come down, and Mifune goes to the secret passageway and beats them there, and they say, "You didn't tell us there was a secret passageway," and he's sort of mocking them. It's just a total like Laurel and Hardy moment in the middle of this sort of mock epic, and it's just I think a terrific moment. Now, The Bad Sleep Well is the next film, and it ends the 1950s there. And I've read a lot of people who think this is not a particularly good film, and I have to say I don't know what the hell they're watching, because to me this is maybe just a notch below High and Low. The whole setup, the attack on the corporations, the Mifune character doesn't win in the end, and to me one of the most chilling and scary moments in all of film is when the servile director or whatnot is talking on the phone at the end of the film. He's lost his family, he's lost everything, but still he bows to the VP and says, basically, "Yes, I will do what you want," and hangs up the phone. And to me, it's one of the most it's one of the probably his most politically charged film, I would think. And I just don't understand why so many film critics that I've read don't think highly enough of it.
Well, maybe if you think of it as an adaptation of Hamlet, there's probably maybe not enough Hamlet. People think of it as in that way. I don't necessarily think of it as an adaptation of Hamlet.
No, I don't either.
And Ron is Lear. But I think it's a fine film too, and it's another great performance by Mifune.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it also looks forward to High and Low, which, despite its wonderfulness as a detective film, also has a lot to say about corporate Japan. The willingness to cut corners and to sacrifice people and to have this materialistic outlook. And I think that's a great thing. The other thing I like about The Bad Sleep Well is the way in which he regrets very much what he has to do to the woman whom he marries.
Yeah.
It's a very nice, Lola's point about the women in Kurosawa makes me think that this is except for Lola's work, an understudied topic, but also the sacrifice of the woman in some ways to his goals that he doesn't achieve in any case.
And again, it's a film that's very much a post-war film. He and his friend, whose identity is taken, talk about being in the black market as young people after the war, how they worked in the factory just during the war. They must have been very young when they did that. And they're walking through bits of Tokyo that are still devastated as they hold their conversations. So it's a theme that he picks up again in a different way in Yojimbo about the growing corruption in a recovering Japan, which began to be something that he was occupied with, I think, in the early 60s.
The thing with this film is the changing perspectives. It opens up with the reporters basically for the first 20 minutes setting up the story at this wedding. Then we get the Mifune character's point of view. We get the character that Mifune has switched his identity with. We get his take on things. We get Mifune pointing out to the guy he recruits to come on his side how reality is. We get the reality of the corporate mongers. We get the Weiss idea, and all of that. It's again so complex in the way that Kurosawa is shifting the perspective that by the end when he dies, in the setup car crash or whatnot, we don't know to what extent the malfeasance has gone. We don't know the exact whys and wherefores. But again, then we end with that that sort of definitive end with that phone call. And I think it's just a very underrated film from what I can read from other critics. Um, Let me talk then about Yojimbo and Sanjuro, and I think someone had mentioned, I think David had mentioned one of his more financially successful ones. I think this pair, though, and especially Yojimbo, wasn't that at the time, wasn't that like his biggest box office at the time? Because these two films are again Mifune in this mythic characterization, and it's probably the same character in both films, although there's some debate about that. And this is what, again, great comedy in it in totally different ways. The dark comedy of the first film, the sort of Keystone Cops like comedy of the second film. I don't know if David or Lola, you want to talk about these two films.
Have to go, David.
Okay. Well, Yojimbo was a tremendous hit. In a certain way, that's why he made Sanjuro, but refusing to make a direct sequel, he made a kind of prequel, even though it's 200 years difference between them. But Yojimbo was a hugely successful film, and it is, along with Seven Samurai, the film of his that is most remade and reworked. It, however, is an archetypal film as well. I mean, it harkens back to the American Western in obvious ways. The setting, the way the town looks, the loner cleans up the town and then leaves, etc. But so in using the archetypal figure of the loner, he also has made a very Japanese film about corruption, but made it a dark comedy, which I think perhaps he might have been thinking about for The Bad Sleep Well, but just couldn't bring himself to do it. But it's a much more simple film, and it's kind of elegant in its simplicity. I mean, there's no fancy narrative, there's a lot of great camera work, but it's a kind of straightforward movie about a guy who's great with a sword, comes to town, plays off two sides against the middle, and cleans up the town to such an extent there isn't very many people left, and away he goes.
I think that there's something which I've written about that many people miss. There's almost a mystical element to it. That is, he almost seems to be there to grant people's wishes. So the film begins where a couple give him water and their sons run off to be a yakuza, and at the end, the only person he spares is the son that he sends packing back to the parents who need him to return and have been praying for his return. The bartender only asks for one thing, that the family be reunited that's been broken apart by all this, and he gives them that. And I think Sanjuro picks up that kind of mystical element as well, because he comes from the back of a Shinto shrine. But the young man said, I searched it. There was nobody there, 5 minutes ago before we began our meeting. So it adds an element to that kind of loner that is very Japanese. That is the stranger who might actually be a bodhisattva or a Japanese Shinto deity who comes to town and grants your wishes and then goes away again. But you might not be happy with what they leave behind when they go.
Yeah.
But it's also the film that starts a golden age of samurai movies, or we could call swordplay movies, because the sword fighting, the sword play in Yojimbo is so good. It's so exciting, so dynamic. The use of, Mifune's just got a physicality that he uses so well, and he's so strong, and so the sword fighting is just good. Yojimbo is like, he comes into town, he kills a couple guys, lops off an arm. At another point, he kills a dozen guys. Of course, the great climax with Kurosawa's next favorite actor, Nakadai Tatsuya, using him for the first time, right? Yeah. Nakadai Tatsuya, who would be, of course, Kurosawa's new Mifune as the years would go by. And so you've got this great cast, great action, wonderful setup. What could be bad? The same thing in Sanjuro, which I think also plays with, I guess what I call Zen swordsman. You've got the old lady who says the best sword never comes out of its scabbard, and he's embarrassed to be dirty around her. So his character is actually enriched, I think, in Sanjuro. Yes. which in some ways is also a comedy. You call it the Keystone Cops. These little guys with their bald heads.
Yeah.
Very, very funny.
There's the famous centipede scene too. That's just hilarious. Where they look like they're a centipede. What? I'm sorry.
Where they're following him
Yeah,
around.
yeah, yeah. It's called the centipede scene. It's just hilarious. I want to talk about the final two films to end this segment in this golden age. David had mentioned High and Low, and first off, I know the Japanese title literally translates to Heaven and Hell, but I think this is one of the few times, just like with The Bicycle Thief, where the Americanized version of the title is much better. High and Low suggests a lot more than Heaven and Hell, and even though this isn't, one of the 3 or 4 films that's called a Shakespearean adaptation, this, I think, is his most Shakespearean film, because you have a character in the beginning, and it's another one of these bifurcated films, like Akira and what was the other one? You have this setup of the character just on the verge of everything he's wanting to get in all his life. He thinks his son is kidnapped. It's actually his butler's son that's kidnapped. So he has this ethical conundrum. Do I get what I finally have worked for decades, or do I give it all up to be an ethical person? And then we switch to this police procedural. We get this character we don't know anything about, and it's so brilliantly filmed. And at the end, we just get this sort of this great ending where they confront each other. The drawer comes down, and he's just in the face of just utter chaos. There's really no reason why any of this happened except the chaos of the universe and this cracked mind. I just think it's his best film, even better than Seven Samurai. I don't know if Lola or David, you want to jump in about the High and Low?
I think High and Low, Heaven and Hell, the titles, I don't know that one's better than the other, but High and Low certainly is a good title. And I do think it's bifurcated. Remember now, Kurosawa really takes the very basic setup from the novel King's Ransom by Ed McBain.
Yeah.
But if you read the novel, you get a lot more side stuff that Kurosawa eliminates. Even though, excuse me,
yeah.
even though it's a short novel. Sorry. Can't you go? Be right back. It's actually a short novel and a long film, but Kurosawa improves on the novel a great deal.
Oh yeah.
By keeping the focus first on the Mifune character, King, and then turning it into the police procedural where you have all kinds of very interesting stuff. And in the third part, where you really go through hell, where you see this kind of side of Tokyo that you would have thought in 1963 was gone. I mean, that alley of heroin addicts is the scariest thing I've ever seen outside of a zombie film.
Yeah.
So it's really very, very powerful. But the ethical dilemma is, we should give credit at least to Ed McBain, but the filming of it is so interesting, and the narration of the film, how it's told, is so interesting. And the characters are so good. For me, my favorite character is Nakadai.
Yeah.
As the lead detective.
Yeah.
Kurosawa does so many interesting things, which I think a lot of them he gets from Ford, but he expands upon them in so many nice ways.
And it's a film for me that picks up the stray dog moment of the doubled character. So that final scene that you like so much, Dan, where he's in the jail speaking to the man who's tried to blackmail him or kidnap his son and ask and ransom him. They're mirrored across that glass partition that separates them in a way that I think brings us back to the ethical dilemma David's been talking about throughout our conversation, which is how to be a moral person and a heroic man in Japan. And Kurosawa examines this in all sorts of ways.
And I think Kurosawa in this film demonstrates, I've never been a big fan, for example, of Alfred Hitchcock films. I think they're good entertainments, but I could imagine an Alfred Hitchcock version of that Ed McBain story. It would not have had the depth, it would not have had the human drama, it would not have had the psychological prescience that this film has. And just going on to segue into the next film, Redbeard, this is yet another film of his, and I guess I consider this the final film of his golden age. It's the final film he does with Mifune. Uh, this, Again, this is one of these films that seems to be overlooked, and it's a long film. I think about 3 hours, and Mifune gives a terrific performance. There's some wonderful scenes with the woman who tries to seduce the young doctor. There's the young girl who comes in about 2/3 of the way into the film. Then a little bit later, a young urchin. There's so many layers in this film that are overlooked. There's the confrontation with the nurses, with the madam of the whorehouse. Lola, maybe since we've talked about some women in his films. This seems to be his most film that has the most interesting female characters, at least that I've seen.
It has quite a few diverse characters, but don't forget in The Quiet Duel, he's already explored some of this idea of the nurse who used to be a prostitute that he confides in. So I think we see that these things don't just come out of nowhere, that they're themes that he's long been interested in, Kurosawa. It was a very difficult film to make. I mean, they filmed for, was it 2 years, David? Was it a long time?
Yeah.
And Mifune resented that he had to be there for so much of the time, and he was contractually obliged to do other things, and he had to have this stupid beard he couldn't shave off. So I think it was a very tense film to make, and maybe that's one of the things that comes through and has made it less successful. But also, it's a drama of the type that was going a little bit out of fashion, I think, in the early '60s in Japan. They were looking more towards domestic comedies at that point. I think you were seeing a shift in what audiences liked. But yes, the women in there are fascinating, and he gets to use some of his favorite actresses. And anyway,
it's interesting. It's interesting, Dan. You can think of Redbeard as the end of a incredible period of productivity and unprecedented artistry. And Redbeard may be a little bit overlooked, but as I recall, it did win the Kinema Jumbo Best One Award.
I think it did, yeah.
Is that right? Of course, the Japanese cinema by '65 is not what it used to be, even a few years earlier. And it's the last film that Kurosawa would make that would be. Well, it took a lot of time to make, but so did Seven Samurai. But after this, his career takes, the kind of nosedive. Partly because after this, he goes to try and make Tora Tora Tora, which somebody wrote a book on the making of Tora 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 and Kurosawa's involvement, and Kurosawa just went crazy, literally trying to make this film Tora Tora Tora. But in any case, I think Redbeard is a bit underrated. It is interested in as much the patience that Redbeard treats.
Yeah.
But anyway, I was about to say, you think of this as the end of a golden era, but I think of this as the looking forward to the next period. That Redbeard looks very much forward to Dodeska Den, and then looks forward to some other later Kurosawa films, though not the big Kagemusha and Ram. But so for me, Redbeard is a transition into Dodeska Den, as well as a kind of period on the end of this great period that he had. But I think it's a wonderful film. Mifune's strength that he's built up in Yojimbo and Sanjuro really works well in this context of this kind of heroic doctor trying to fight against mental illness and physical abuse and things like that.
Well, in the final segment, let's look at that final period. I want to also talk about his financial struggles, his not being able to get backing in the '70s, and then his legacy and closing remarks, and we'll do that in a moment. In this last segment, I do want to speak about the later period of Kurosawa, most famously some of the films, but also some of the struggles he had. We touched upon some of the personal issues that Kurosawa had in the last segment. You mentioned Tora Tora Tora, David, and famously he was supposed to direct the Japanese half of that film about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. This led, I guess, as you mentioned, to his spiraling down to try to commit suicide. He didn't. He did Dodesca Den in '70. Then there was a 5-year period. I guess he was recuperating from the attempt. Let's talk about that period, the films, the suicide attempt, and those two films in the '70s, Dodesca Den and Dersu Azala.
Well, Dodesca Den was the first film of a new company called the Yonki no Kai, or Richie translated it years ago as the Three Musketeers, or the Four Musketeers, the only four. So four of the biggest directors tried to form a company to make films. Dodesca Den was the first one that was released, and it was a big failure financially. I put it in, I'm the only one, but I put it in the top 5 of Kurosawa's masterpieces. I think it's a wonderful film about humanity. All of the stories really work well for me. They're very moving. It's a very sentimental film, but I think it earns its sentiment. But in any case,
David, let me just ask you. You said all the stories. Was this one of these sort of 1960s, early '70s foreign films that was an anthology film then?
No, it wasn't. No, he just tells multiple stories linked by.
Okay, because I haven't seen it. Okay.
Yeah, they're linked by place, but you get little vignettes of many of the characters,
Okay.
and then you leave one character, and then you come back to them. So it's a story of setting. And there's a lot of Asian films like to do that. A place. Hong Kong movies, Chinese movies, Indian movies like to have these kinds of stories about a place rather than a specific character. But it was a big failure, and Kurosawa went into a spiral, and don't forget that Dersu was completely financed by and made in the Soviet Union. So it won its Academy Award not as a Japanese movie, but as a Russian film.
I think the context becomes very important. We're looking at a period of time when, as in the U.S., television was where a lot of the directors of Kurosawa's generation had to head, because Dai Studios, which was one of the 2 studios Kurosawa had continually worked with, closed down, which was why he formed his own production company. You're getting great directors like Honda making Godzilla as a way forward, or just not making films anymore. So it was a moment of crisis. And Kurosawa decides to make his first film in his new production company about a part of Tokyo that people were trying to forget. It's a part of Tokyo that still exists. I lived there in 2003-4, and I rode on the tram every day, and I thought of Dodesca Den every time I rode on it, which is the old downtown, the Shitamachi area of Japan, where the working class and underclass of Japan lived. And in a time when the Japanese were beginning to laud themselves for having recovered from the war, it was after the Olympics, and Tokyo was supposed to be a bustling modern city. He makes a film about people who live in the ghettos of Tokyo, and in a style of an Italian neo-realist film with that color palette as well. And it just did not go down well with the Japanese. I think foreign viewers liked it better.
Was he just considered passe by the financiers, people who would put up money there? Well, I mean, he had done so many of these great films in the prior couple of decades. Did they just think he was?
They couldn't afford it.
Yeah, they couldn't afford him anymore. You remember the only time he got very active again between the big films of Kagemusha and Ran was in the last 3 films of his life. And the last 3 films of his career were fairly small. And, Madadayo was very small. I mean, Dreams, I guess, was a big film. But after that, he gets much more modest. But they simply couldn't afford him. A lot of the directors, I mean, you look at the careers of Kobayashi. I mean, he was one of the greatest directors of the late 50s, early 60s. Kobayashi barely worked in this same period. Kinoshita, who had a great deal of success in the 50s and 60s, was virtually retired. So you had literally the passing of a generation, and these guys were, in their 60s, and 50s and 60s. And they could no longer work in the studio system, which couldn't afford them.
And I think that combined with his international fame. So Richie felt quite strongly that becoming internationally successful meant that Kurosawa couldn't work in Japan anymore. But it was a combination of that international success that kept him going, alongside with the demise of the studio system. It wasn't the one single thing that happened to Kurosawa.
Yeah.
And yes, Tora was a terrible moment. And I think in the book it documents how he was so used to working with his own crew at his own pace for as long as he wanted, that the unions telling him he couldn't keep filming or he couldn't keep doing all these takes. So that about Hollywood was very destructive for him. So he was Japanese. He was a Japanese filmmaker to the core. He just had to look elsewhere for funding as the 70s and 80s went on.
And famously, it was Coppola and Lucas that came to his rescue for Kagemusha, and then subsequently, I guess, Ron in the wake of Kagemusha. And so let's talk about those two films, because those I saw Dreams, and it's called a mishmash anthology film. It's the first film I ever saw of Kurosawa a year or two after it came out, and it's okay. I haven't seen the last two we'll talk about in a bit, but the last two films I think of any real substance are Kagemusha and Ron. And I know most people favor Ron, but I think Kagemusha is the better film, and I recently rewatched both of them. Ron has a kind of Lord of the Rings kind of quality. It almost feels like it's in a fantasy fairy tale kind of world compared to Kagemusha, which is much more, I think, set in a realistic setting. It's grittier. It's the performance by Nakadai in both of them is very good for different reasons. But there's I think a psychological realism in Kagemusha that I don't find in Ron. Let's talk about those two films, because to me they're sort of paired in people's minds. But would you agree, for example, that Ron seems to be the bolder film color-wise, and it has to me more of that Hobbit, Lord of the Rings kind of otherworldly feel to it? What are your takes on both of these films?
I prefer Kagemusha to Ron as well. I think Kagemusha uses a historical setting very well. I mean, a lot of the main characters are are derived from historical figures. It's about the ending of the Civil War period in Japan, and right on the cusp of the great Tokugawa era. So these great historical figures who are joining together to fight to unify the country is very exciting. It's very interesting to me in that this is a samurai movie in which no one dies by the sword. It's the beginning of the samurai era, so to speak, and yet we've already seen the obsolescence of the samurai. I like the way the Lord Shingen is killed by an ordinary soldier who uses what do you call physics and mechanical engineering to set up the rifle to kill him.
Yeah,
I think that's just my favorite scene in all of the film. But it's just a historically based, whereas Ron is this. I think he's trying too hard to be Lear rather than to be Japanese history.
I think so, and also you have that doubling, that theme Kurosawa's been interested in as well.
yeah.
I mean, the Kagemusha is the double of the great lord, and it asks different more questions than Ron. Ron asks, I think Ron has its merits because it asks a question of what happens when a man who's kind of made his life from warring and violence decides he's going to take a step back and leave things to his descendants, who happen to be daughters in this case, because it is Lear. The women don't come out well in this film at all. He descends.
Their sons in Ron.
Their sons in the. But their wives.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm thinking their wives don't come out very well because they're egged on by their wives. And their sort of bravura performances, the daughters-in-law. But in Kagemusha, we get that mulling over again about what's a just war, what does war do to a man. And in Ron, those ideas are there, but he's falling back on the host Shakespearean structure, so he doesn't have to do a lot of work with it. So he plays around with the color. You're right about the palette.
Yeah, it also reminds me, oddly enough, in Ron, I think he uses a one of the deep focus, or what I forget the technique, but he uses one of those long cameras to pull the mountains, to make the mountains look larger. It reminded me of the Western Shane, where you have this very mythic story. And so, to me, the whole landscape and the boldness of the colors says that Ron is of sort of a fairy tale, whereas Kagemusha, as I said, seems to be more rooted in historical reality. Of course, I'm sure it's not really as historically accurate as if it really should be. But so the last three films, as I mentioned, I had seen just Dreams, and it's one of those little anthology films. It's got a couple of interesting things. The weakest one to me is the Martin Scorsese one, is Van Gogh, and I haven't seen.
And everyone remembers that.
Yeah, and I haven't seen the last two films. So if maybe you guys could just give some thoughts on these three films, these three final acts.
He's back to thinking about the atomic bomb, I think. The sort of science fiction-y element of Dreams is about the sort of aftermath of a great disaster. Rhapsody in August, which was criticized by Americans terribly because Richard Gere seems to apologize for the war, although it's not clear if he's apologizing because her husband has died. He just says, "I'm so sorry." But anyway, so it was panned by American critics, and even Donald Ritchie was angry about it. I remember talking to him not long after it came out. Has that moment where the woman remembers what it was like. And the atomic bomb, I mean, the CGI is not very good, but it's still a startling moment. It's pictured as the white cloud goes up and then the eye of God opens up within that cloud. It's an astonishing moment. Both those films share that sense maybe that you mentioned in Ron, of fairy tale. So the grandchildren in Rhapsody in August keep walking into the countryside that their grandmothers described in stories she told to them. So and in Dreams, of course, we're looking at dreams and his paintings. Kurosawa returns to his love of painting in that. So he's kind of experimenting with the quality of experience and film in interesting ways. Madadayo, I think less so. I always think Wild Strawberries and Madadayo kind of go together. But I think there's something to be said for what he's trying to do in these last films. Whether they're successful or not is a different question.
David, do you have a comment on any of these last films?
Oh yes, Dreams is one of these, because it's an anthology film. It's uneven. Kurosawa claims they were actual dreams. I doubt it. It's visually very stunning. He uses a lot of Japanese folk tales to. I think he's trying to make a very Japanese movie. The first two are very clearly folktale and Shinto derived, but even the one about the guy who's dying in the snow and then the snow witch comes in.
Yeah.
He's also telling a kind of history. He's also telling a kind of history of Japan with the kind of rural days of high Shintoism, and then you get the war, and then you get the nuclear, the post-war, and then the ending with the Ryuchishu in this imagined village. All of these things, but some of it's work, some of it doesn't. As for Rhapsody in August, I've been in print very harsh on the movie. In some ways, the performances by the young kids are objectively bad. The film is very didactic. He uses the young kids as audience stand-in, and so what they learn about the bombing, it takes place in Nagasaki. What they learn about the bombing, we learn about the bombing, and they go to Nagasaki and they see the memorials and things like that, and the old woman remembers. And he shoots the old woman in the same way he would shoot the samurai in Seven Samurai, except she has an umbrella instead of a sword. So these things, it's too easy to make fun of its weaknesses. But it is, again, both in Dreams and in parts of Dreams and in Rhapsody in August, a kind of definitely a return to the bomb. So there's an importance to it. But the use of Richard Gere as a half Japanese Hawaiian guy, Americans just went crazy over the film because it's Kurosawa. because it's about the bombing of Nagasaki, you know, you implicitly get to the question of, you know, should we have dropped the bomb? Do we have to apologize? And so whatever merits the film had were lost in the discourse surrounding the bomb.
Yeah, I think actually Kagamusha's dream sequence was actually better than anything in Dreams. The one where the imposter is being chased by the Lord. But let me just end this by asking about the current legacy of Kurosawa, and then giving you some closing thoughts. I think David earlier you had mentioned that Kurosawa is sort of, you know, if not passe, is just not studied or enough, I guess maybe even in film schools there. What do you think accounts for that? And do you think as years go on, as we head towards the middle of this century, that's going to change and he's going to be seen as a valuable cultural resource going forward?
For the Japanese, he was always a kind of ambivalence. I mean, he did win the Kinematomo Award a couple of times. They respect him. They know he was a great filmmaker, but he never was beloved. And also in Japan, you have to remember that the sort of world of film is fairly small, and some filmmakers become very important, not because of anything intrinsic, but because of who writes about them. In a certain way, Ozu has become the go-to Japanese director because of a very important critic, Hasumi Shigehiko, has written a wonderful book on Ozu. So, and Hasumi's impact on modern filmmaking is almost incalculable. As much as any director, this critic who became president of the University of Tokyo, now retired, has been so influential. So maybe, but I think in the West, people know Kurosawa. Filmmakers know how influential he is. So I'm not sure that he's understudied. He may be sufficiently studied, let's say. I don't know that there'll be that much more work on him, except Lola said she's working on some stuff, so that's great.
But he,
otherwise, you know, I don't think he's underrated. I mean, I think everyone would admit that his legacy is incalculable. I mean, as you said before, Dan, he's, you know, Fellini, Bergman, I said Eisenstein, you know, Kurosawa is in that group of the most influential.
but you would say that he is more looked upon favorably in Western critical and historical eyes?
Yeah, probably so.
Yeah.
Probably.
Lola?
Yes, I think the West has found more in him. When you look at the books written about Kurosawa in Japanese, they're all about his use of sound, his use of light, of the cameras. So I think the Japanese think of him, if there's anything to be learned from him, is that he was a good technician. Western filmmakers know he was a brilliant technician and have tried to reproduce what he did, but also find something more in the films. Whether it's moments of beauty or the stories he chooses to tell, as much as the technology. I think he is losing importance simply because, you know, his films are 60, 70 years old now. And as David said at the beginning, you know, where's film as a medium going to, and what's going to happen? But you know, you never know how memories pop up and people go in and out of fashion. So I say he still matters.
Lola, since you had mentioned that you write about the females in his films, for anyone just coming to Kurosawa, what do you think are, say, the 2 or 3 most critical performances to watch in Kurosawa? Would it be the wife in Rashomon, the girl in Hidden Fortress, and if you were to pick for someone coming at his films from that angle, what are sort of the essential roles?
There are more than you might imagine. I mean, in Yojimbo, there's the brothel keepers, the mother. You know, there's the beautiful young mother, and then there's the middle-aged mother who's the wife of the gangster in the brother. That's a brilliant performance by a great actress who is also brilliant in The Lower Decks. I mean, she's also there. What's her name? You remember, David? Yamada. She's brilliant in that. I think yes, Rasamon is a brilliant performance. Washishu's wife in Throne of Blood is an astonishing performance. Although the wonderful story is that she didn't know what to do under all that no makeup and said to Kurosawa, "What am I supposed to be feeling?" And he said that you're being paid a lot of money to do this role. Just do it. I think he got good performances out of his female actresses, but they were never the center of his films.
Yeah, well, just when you said that, famously, Hitchcock said actors are cattle. Did Kurosawa, was he an actor's director or was he a director's director? Would you say?
That's a hard one. I think for some of his actors, like Shimoda, he was an actor's director.
Yeah.
But I think for his legacy, he's a director's director.
Yeah, I think that's well said. You read about Rashomon and how he directed the actors in terms of thinking of animals, and that seemed to be the case. But otherwise, you don't read too much about how he directed. Like you get good actors, and you let them do their thing. That's a lot of directors do that, and the casting is everything. So in that respect, he was a director's director. He was interested in historical accuracy. In the basics, Kagemusha is historically correct. Certainly, all of the things like the weaponry and the costumes would be very much correct. But I do think he was a great technician who had more heart and sentiment than perhaps he's given credit for, because he's so good with all the elements of cinema: sound, lighting, editing. Don't forget that one of the things in Kurosawa's music. One of the things in Kurosawa's movies is there is no editing credit. He's the editor. He gets a co-writing credit, or sometimes he gives up the credit, but there's no editing credit. So in a certain way, he makes his films with an eye toward what they're going to look like when they're finished, and then he puts them together.
Yeah, it's actually there's a good thing on YouTube. A fellow named Tony Lamb or something, I forget, has a video on Vimeo that analyzes a scene from The Bad Sleep Well in a sort of numerical metrical pattern. It's the scene where Mifune sets up the cowardly little guy by putting money in his satchel as the boss comes in, and it really shows how brilliantly edited and set up the scene was. But let me ask you, David, for closing, in sum, if you had mentioned your 5 masterpieces, can you say which 5 masterpieces you would recommend for someone to watch, and then any closing remarks?
Sure. I would have to go with. Let's see if I can get 5. Now I say 5 just probably off the top of my head, but you put me on the spot, so I'm going to go with Stray Dog, Ikiru, Seven Samurai, Yojimbo, and High and Low. And then I'm going to sneak in a 6th of Dodescadin.
Okay, and for any young viewer or someone just coming to Kurosawa, other than those films, what would you say is the thing that they should maybe look for or appreciate the most in Kurosawa vis-a-vis some other directors?
Well, I think you have to look for Kurosawa as one of the greatest technical directors of all time, and just look how he for me. Look how he tells his stories. He's a storyteller. In that respect, he's like Howard Hawks, who claimed to be only telling stories. Kurosawa never claimed only to be telling stories, but just look how he tells the stories. Watch what he does, narratively. Watch what he does with the camera. Watch how his stories unfold, and that's what movies are about, and that's why Kurosawa is such a great director. He knows how to tell a story on film.
And Lola, if you could give your closing remarks, and also if you wanted to recommend a film or a performance that someone coming first to Kurosawa, if you could recommend 1 or 2 things.
Well, I already mentioned No Regrets for Our Youth. You have to have Seven Samurai. I do think Throne of Blood is a brilliant film. Yojimbo, I have a lot of love for, simply because Clint Eastwood owns his entire career to Yojimbo.
And I think didn't Kurosawa say that he made more money off of Yojimbo because Leone stole the idea for the first Fistful film?
He had to sue him,
yeah.
but yes, there was a long court case over it. And I do like Hidden Fortress. It has I think it's an uneven film, but it has it has some wonderful moments that I enjoy. Standout performances. I think perhaps, as David said, because he tended to let actors do what they did best. You'd have me here the rest of the afternoon telling
Okay.
you what some of the standout performances are. I think in little and big ways he got good things out of actors. It could be uneven, but let's go with Rashomon,
Okay.
which I know David thinks tends to be overrated, but I think that there are moments in that where Mifune has to act literally his clothes off. He's a bandit. He's kind of seduces the husband, but he's after the wife. He switches back and forth so much. Shimura Nikeru, of course, but also in Seven Samurai, where he's the wise leader. I think that's a brilliant performance by Shimura. And I think quite often when you read directors saying about something they're trying to accomplish, and they're trying to do it not in against the green screen, but are trying to do it live, they do mention Kurosawa, or the critics mention Kurosawa. This battle scene recalls Kurosawa. The editing of this scene, because I think he's there. I think he's constantly with us, even if ordinary viewers can't always pinpoint. That comes from something Kurosawa did.
Yeah, I know in Kagemusha there's the scenes where the troops are riding into battle, and you see, or maybe it's Ron too, you see the different lines of the troops going in and out of focus as if each of them gets their little moment heading into battle. That's just an interesting take that you don't get in a lot of other big epics. But anyway, I just wanted to thank both of you for your time. Anyone who is interested in either David's or Lola's writings, I'll have a link to their web pages below. Next weekend, I'll have a similar show with a few experts talking about the life and career of Andrei Tarkovsky. So again, to Lola and David, thank you.
Thank you, Dan.